Welcome back to our example 3 here in PioSolver, and now we are going to enter the ranges for both the big blind and the button in this scenario. So let's start with this from the big blind because that is our perspective. And I'm going to click on this and open up our own ranges here. And as you can see here, I have a Solver School folder, and what I want to show you here is this is my 3-bet range. And what you'll see here is this is actually if you've watched my GTO Plus example from example 2, this is actually the converse of the big blind defense range in this spot. Because the scenario is actually the same. We're the big blind, and we are now playing against a button who is a professional player who has just opened us. We're going to have a calling range, which we looked at in example 2, but now we're also going to have a big blind 3-bet range, and this is that big blind 3-bet range. Now, I know my ranges really well, and I feel comfortable that I am able to execute this range pretty effectively, and this is going to be the range that I'm going to be showing up with here. So because I want to model the actual gameplay as well as possible, I'm going to choose to use this range as my 3-bet range. Now let's look at the in-position player. And let's first look at the button opening range. So from an equilibrium standpoint, and this is actually the equilibrium opening range that we used in example 2, but this is our button opening range that we would be using in this example. But once the button opens and gets 3 bets, there is going to be a narrowing of this range. So some of the weaker hands in this range, so you can kind of picture some of the hands like Queen 2 suited, Jack 4 suited. It's kind of some of the hands that kind of fit on the outsides here. Some of these offsuit hands that are kind of really weak that are here, they're going to be just folded. Then some of the strongest hands in range, so some of the real top end hands like aces and kings and ace king suited and things like that, and maybe a couple bluffs like ace 5 suited or hands with good blocker properties, they'll be included in a 4-bet range. But you're actually going to see a lot of these hands kind of, and even up to some of the really strong hands, be included into a call range. So actually, and as I've mentioned in the past, I think that a lot of times with professionals, using equilibrium ranges are really good to model professional gameplay because it's going to kind of blend a lot of possible profiles together. Instead of necessarily assuming that they're all going to have the same exact range, there's going to be some sort of, I don't want to say mixing, but there's going to be some sort of blending that's in place to account for the fact that not all of those professional players are going to have the same exact ranges there. So we can actually look at the equilibrium ranges here for a button call versus a big blind 3-bet, and this is what that equilibrium range would look like here. So you can see here that some of these kind of like weaker hands, like as I mentioned, some of these weaker suited queens, the suited jacks, some of the hands, these kind of like lower suited 2-gappers are not going to be in range anymore. Those hands are just going to be folded. These weaker offsuit aces, weaker offsuit King X, King 9, Queen 9, Jack 9, some of these hands that are kind of in this part of range are going to be folded here too, as well as some of the weaker offsuit broadways. They're not going to be always in range, but sometimes they might be in range. And then finally, some of the top end hands like aces, ace king suited, kings, they're going to be put into 4-bet ranges, as well as hands like ace king off, ace queen suited, ace queen off, ace jack suited, and you can kind of see this kind of gradient take place, right? So it starts with, you never see ace king suited, to you sometimes see ace queen suited, you usually see ace jack suited, and so on and so forth, and it kind of blends to a point where you always see certain hands in range. And I think this is actually a really good range to work with here for the button, because I think this really will accurately represent the overall scenario with which we are playing. We are playing against an opponent who is going to be calling at a good frequency. They're not going to necessarily be overfolding. So maybe if this was a recreational player, we might expect them to have hands like King 3 suited to open and then fold, right? We might expect them to take some of their, 9-7 suited, 8-6 suited, 5-3 suited hands. 5-3 suited might be a hand that a recreational player just opens, if they even open at all, but they open and then fold to a 3-bet. Whereas really at the equilibrium, that hand should not be folded to a 3-bet here, particularly when we're this deep. We're 200 big blinds deep, so we have to remember that and take that into account when we look at these ranges as well too. So anyways, this is, I think, a good range for us to start with here, and we will use this as our button defense range. So now we've got our out-of-position players range, we got our in-position players range. Let's shift over to example 4 and build out ranges for that example as well. So now it's time to enter ranges here for example 4. And again, we're looking at this from the buttons perspective, and we are in position and we're going up against an out of position player who is a recreational player who 3-bet us. So let's actually start with the out of position player. So I'm going to open up our out of position players range, and as I've mentioned in previous videos, I like to start with the upswing ranges as a baseline in a lot of examples and work from there. So I have here our upswing example. So for a big blind 3-bet, this is what an upswing range looks like. And this might be fine to account for in some scenarios here, but what we're going to see is, and I'll leave the range as is for now, like I did in the GTO Plus examples here too, but we're going to adjust this a lot when it gets to the blending portion of the videos, because what we can see specifically from looking at our assumptions here is that our opponent is a recreational player who's not going to be 3-betting widely enough and who is only going to be 3-betting mostly top end value. So right away, we're going to know that our 3-bet range is going to be far less than this 10.3%. And a lot of these kind of weaker bluff hands in range, as well as some of the lower end of the top portion of the range, is going to be taken out of this range. So we're going to end up with something that's much more dense into this aces, kings, queens, ace, king suited, ace, king offsuit region, with it starting to fade off throughout. So we'll do that in the blending, but let's just start with the upswing ranges as our out of position range. For the in position range here, I'm going to pull up, this is my in position button call range versus a big blind 3-bet. So if I kind of take it back to a equilibrium perspective, you can kind of see that at equilibrium, it's about 21% of combos, and you can kind of see the combos that the solver at equilibrium chooses to call in this open defend range against a big blind 3-bet. As I've mentioned, again, I like to keep things in pure frequencies, so I've kind of shifted that to be this range right here. So some of the offsuit Broadway hands, I find that they're more trouble than they're worth to try to play those hands, and I tend to just kind of release pre-flop. And some of the weaker hands in range here that may have been included at some partial frequencies, I've basically kind of removed them out of the range. I've also taken some of these hands that were mostly calls and essentially made them always calls, whereas I'm always 4-betting here ace 5 suited, aces, kings, and ace king suited. So this is kind of the range that I'm going to start with, but I'm going to signal that we are going to adjust this range as well too, because the information that we have that our opponent is not 3-betting widely enough, we're probably going to be losing a lot of money if we're calling with this range against an opponent who is mostly 3-betting aces, kings, queens, and not a lot of additional hands in range. Yes, we're deep. Yes, we're in position. Yes, we probably can call a little bit more widely than one might think that we could call, but it's definitely not going to be as widely as this right here, unless our opponent is just terrible and can't necessarily play post-flop out of position, which is quite possible as well too. But we're going to kind of hedge and go somewhere in the middle there, and we'll talk about that in a few videos when we talk about blending. But we're going to start with, this is my standard set of ranges, and this is what we're going to include for the defense range here for the button. So we got our out of position player, we got our in position player. Let's wrap this video up. In the next video, I'm going to talk about bet sizing. We're going to go back over to the slides. I'll talk about bet sizing, the considerations you might have in bet sizings, and how you might kind of take all of that into account to build out bet sizes that are going to work for you in your inputs. So I'll see you over in that video.